The small town of Parkville had always seemed peaceful. The local buzz of evenings when residents gathered in the stadium for school games was not drowned out by the larger concerns of the city. In these stands, laughter and applause mingled with quiet conversations, and there was always a light air of old America in the air, a place where everyone knew each other, where it was easy to forget about the world beyond these narrow streets. But even here, behind this idyllic facade, there were dark corners. And as is often the case in such towns, the darkest secrets are not always obvious to the outside observer. Charlie Blake was one of those Parkville knew and who had been a part of his life for many years. He was a baseball coach at the local school, and although his career was not particularly outstanding, he had earned respect for many years of working with local teenagers. Charlie's appearance was not particularly special. Tall, with short blonde hair, slightly aged with wrinkles that became more noticeable with each passing year. His gaze was tired, but at the same time there was a hidden confidence in it that permeated his behavior. He was not a bad person, but during his time working in Parkville he had become part of the system, part of this small community, and no matter how hard he tried to hide his doubts and worries, he was already a part of this world. A world that was limited to those four walls of the school and the school stadium. Lucy Wilson was one of the brightest personalities in this school. Unlike most of her classmates, she was a real star, a cheerleader whose attractiveness was combined with charisma and confidence. Lucy was not just a girl who came to sports for popularity. She was always one step ahead, knowing how to use her beauty and charm to achieve her goals. During training, she was full of energy, her movements were precise and graceful, and her gaze was burning and demanding. Lucy was born and raised in Parkville, and despite her ambition, she always felt that her life was limited by the boundaries of this small world. Charlie and Lucy's relationship began quietly, with simple glances and casual touches. At first, it seemed harmless. A baseball coach praising his student for her success, and she, in turn, reaching out to him feeling supported and attentive. But things became much more complicated as the glances became more frequent and the touches became more prolonged. Charlie, accustomed to loneliness and boredom in his life, couldn't help but notice how something in his soul began to change. Lucy, with her laughter and lightness, undoubtedly brought light into his world. For Lucy, this connection was something new. She was used to being the center of attention, but Charlie's attention was different. It wasn't the typical admiration she often received from her classmates or coaches. Charlie saw her for who she was, and that was a new feeling for her. He saw her not as an object of admiration, but as a person with an inner world and complexity. Lucy found this attractive, and although she didn't want to admit it, she was beginning to depend on the attention. Their relationship became more and more intense, hidden from prying eyes. Every moment when they were alone began to acquire special meaning. Lucy, who felt that her life was not limited to the school stadium, increasingly sought solitude with Charlie, where they could allow themselves to be themselves, forgetting about all conventions. He, in turn, enjoyed it, although he knew that what they were doing could not be called right. Charlie could not, and did not want to, admit to himself that this had become something more than just a friendly relationship. But no matter how hard they tried to keep it a secret, the shadow of their relationship was too obvious to those around them. There are no secrets in a small town, and although everyone pretended nothing was going on, rumors had already begun to circulate within Parkville. People discussed their silent meetings and noticed how they avoided the eyes of others. In the eyes of some Parkville residents, this was something out of this world, a coach and a cheerleader, people who should be role models for everyone, suddenly became the heroes of one of the dirtiest secret stories. Lucy couldn't help but notice how her attention was gradually shifting from Charlie to another person. James Collins, a new transfer student at their school, was the one who caught her attention. He was the captain of the basketball team, and his confidence was noticeable even among his peers. James was bright and charismatic, and he quickly won the sympathy of everyone around him. Lucy couldn't help but sense in him someone who could become her partner not only in sports events, but also in life. This became a reason for her to think, and, strangely enough, Charlie began to feel that his power over her was weakening. As Lucy spent more and more time with James, Charlie began to feel abandoned. He began to realize that their relationship was just part of his loneliness, and Lucy, in turn, was ready to move on, to leave her past behind. This thought tormented him. He could not afford to lose her. With her growing interest in James, Charlie felt his inner world crumbling, and he was not ready to accept that end. Lucy had become more than just a student or a pupil to him. She was his light, his salvation. And now, as that light began to dim, Charlie was ready to do anything to keep her close. That night, when Lucy told him for the last time that she was going to move on, Charlie realized that her decision was more than just words. It was the beginning of the end, and it was an end he wasn't going to allow. The evenings in Parkville were growing longer and the days were getting shorter. Autumn was already coming into its own, and with each passing day the town was becoming immersed in golden brown tones. The leaves on the trees were falling, giving the surrounding landscapes a special melancholy, as if nature itself was preparing for something inevitable, hidden beyond the horizon. Everything around was breathing anticipation of changes that were still invisible to most residents, but which were obvious to a few people who found themselves in the center of this intertwining of destinies. Charlie Blake continued his work as before, coaching the school baseball team, but every day became a torturous trial for him. He could no longer calmly look at Lucy as before. Every glance, every gesture of hers, all this was like a punch in the stomach for him. She spent more and more time with James Collins, the new star player of the basketball team. There was something easy, relaxed in their communication that was so lacking in his relationship with her. He saw how her eyes filled with fire when she looked at him, how she began to laugh and be confident in herself as never before. Charlie tried to distract himself by focusing on his duties. He trained with the boys on the field. They were getting better, but his thoughts always returned to Lucy. He knew that her departure was inevitable, but he did not want to accept it. He believed that if she were with him, everything would be different. His life had lost its meaning, and this thought depressed him more and more. Lucy, meanwhile, was being drawn deeper into her new world. James was interesting to her not only as a person, but as a new challenge. He was confident, full of ambition, and at some point she felt she could be on an equal footing with him. Her life, which had seemed so cramped and limited in Parkville, now seemed like an open space for possibility. James did not try to control her, did not demand from her anything she could not give. He simply accepted her as she was, and this gave her strength. They spent a lot of time together, and the more Lucy got to know James, the more she became convinced that he was the man she wanted to be with. He was a good listener and supported her ambitions and dreams. Lucy began to dream of a future where Parkville was just a small dot on her path. James promised her that their life would be much more exciting than she could have ever imagined. But despite all this, Lucy still couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt. She knew that Charlie was disappointed that he was her first, and this knowledge did not give her peace. However, she understood that she could no longer continue to be in a relationship with him that did not truly lead to a future. She tried to be honest as best she could, but with each passing day she realized that she could no longer deceive herself. Charlie grew more desperate with each passing day. He saw her fading glances, her coldness, and he felt it every time he saw her at practice or at school events. Lucy, when she still stopped for a few seconds to meet his gaze, was no longer the Lucy who had existed before. She was distant, alien, and it all felt like a betrayal. One day, after a particularly stressful day at the stadium, When Charlie could barely hide his irritation, he saw Lucy and James strolling across the schoolyard. Lucy was holding his hand and they both looked happy, oblivious to everyone around them. Something inside Charlie snapped. It was like being struck by lightning, so hard he could barely breathe. He felt his heart squeeze. It wasn't just anger, it was a sense of ultimate loss. He was a nobody. He had been robbed of what he once thought was his. After that, Charlie couldn't find a place for himself. He tried to believe that everything would settle down with time, that Lucy would come back again. But this thought became increasingly empty. He tried to control his emotions, but he could not contain the growing anger. Both anger and pain intertwined inside him, creating a monster that he did not know. Lucy continued to destroy everything that was connected to his world. There was no room for regret in her eyes. She, like everyone else, moved forward. James became her support, her future, and she felt that she had finally found the freedom she had dreamed of for so long. But was it real freedom? Lucy began to wonder about it, but it was too late to look for answers. Her life with James seemed like an easy path forward, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was running away from something important. And when she came home one night on one of her walks and found Charlie standing at her door, her heart skipped a beat. She knew he'd come for an explanation, but there was no explanation. He just stood there, and there was emptiness in his eyes and coldness and something more. Something that made her feel like she wasn't just leaving someone behind. She was destroying something. She couldn't put her finger on what, but everything had changed, and it was irreversible. But despite all this, Lucy decided that she could not go back. Charlie had lost her, and now nothing could bring back what had been before. The days grew colder, and with each new morning mist, a sense of uneasy silence came over Parkville. The leaves that had not yet fallen trembled on the branches, the last vestiges of a summer that seemed never to have ended. But for Charlie Blake, summer was long gone, along with the time when everything had been clear and understandable. Now his world was swallowed by darkness, and he did not know how to get out of it. There was no room for doubt or hesitation in his life. He was a coach, a man with clear principles, and he always knew what to do in any situation. But with Lucy, it was different. She changed him. She showed him that his life, filled with rules and clear goals, was actually empty. He thought she would be his salvation, but in the end, she became what destroyed him. Charlie tried to restore some illusion of normalcy by continuing to coach the team, but he didn't have the calm or confidence that had helped him get through the tough days. His heart was filled with bitterness and anger, and all he could do was hide it behind fatigue as his baseball team worked without much change as usual. He met the eyes of each of his players, but something was wrong. He could see that they noticed his condition but didn't know how to communicate with him. His attention was scattered, and when someone made a mistake, his reaction was quick and painful, like a lightning strike. Lucy and James continued to be together, and although Lucy carefully avoided communicating with Charlie, she felt that their meeting was inevitable. One day at the school stadium, when baseball practice was coming to an end, she saw Charlie standing by the fence. He was alone, as if not noticing everyone around him. His gaze was fixed on the ground, and his body was tense as a string. This was the Charlie she knew, strong, determined, but now something in him was broken. She tried to convince herself that she didn't feel anything anymore, that she could leave him behind. But when her eyes met his, she couldn't look away. Something inside her shifted, and she felt her heart squeeze. It was guilt. Lucy tried to hide it, but her body gave in. She slowed her steps, and her breathing became a little deeper, her heart faster. She couldn't explain what it was that kept her here, but she couldn't just leave. There was a pain in his eyes that she knew was there, but tried to ignore. A pain that he tried to hide, and that she might have brought upon him at some point. She was with James, that much was obvious to everyone. He was her future, her plans, her resolve. She believed that with him she could build a life different from the one in Parkville. But this encounter with Charlie reminded her of what she had left behind. She couldn't forget the way he looked at her, the moments they shared when things were simpler. And yet, despite these feelings, she knew that this phase of her life was over. Lucy couldn't go back even if she wanted to. It was all already decided. Charlie felt like he was losing control. He knew Lucy was with James, and it was a test for him. He felt like his own life was falling apart, and he couldn't find the strength to move on. Lucy was gone, and that feeling stayed with him like a curse. He wasn't ready to accept it. Every move she made, every word she said to another guy, was like a knife in his heart. His perception of the world was becoming more and more distorted. He saw her and James at school events, and though they tried to keep a low profile, Charlie knew that everything that was going on between them was obvious. Lucy wasn't who she was to him anymore. She wasn't the girl he once protected, who once trusted him. He had lost her, and it was tearing him apart inside. He felt his jealousy growing into something bigger, more dangerous. It wasn't just a desire to get her back. It was a need to reclaim the control he had lost. His steps became more and more uncertain. He knew he had to let her go, but no matter how hard he tried, it was impossible. Every time he saw her near James, he felt his hands clench into fists. This helplessness began to choke him. He was no longer a coach at the stadium. He had become an observer of his own tragedy. It had been weeks since Lucy had made it clear that her relationship with Charlie was over. He couldn't forget the moment she had told him that their relationship couldn't continue. That pain, that emptiness, that perceived loss were like shadows haunting his daily life. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. If she left, if she stayed with James, he couldn't live in this city without seeing them together. Parkville became more and more alien to him. Every corner of this small world reminded him of his failure, of what he had lost. Charlie began to lose faith in people, in himself, in his city. He felt that life was too cruel and unfair, and that at some point he would not be able to hold on to his own reality. Meanwhile, Lucy continued to live her life as if nothing had happened. She spent more and more time with James, doing the things she loved, training, seeing friends, planning for the future. There was room in her life for everything, except the past she had so resolutely left behind. She knew she couldn't go back, and even if she wanted to, she couldn't. But one day, on one of those foggy, gray evenings, Charlie took a step that would change their lives forever. He could no longer just be an observer. His pain, his loss, and his jealousy became more than he could bear. In that moment, as the shadows grew thicker, he knew his world with Lucy was doomed. But was this the only way out? Charlie Blake felt his world shrinking with each passing day, as if reality itself were squeezing him in from all sides, robbing him of his breathing space. Parkville, his small town, now seemed like a tomb of his past, a place where every corner was saturated with memories of what was gone. He began to change noticeably. His gaze became more sullen, his movements more abrupt, his inner world more obscurantist. He was not ready to accept that his life had ended at its most interesting point. Dark thoughts filled his mind, displacing everything else. Lucy had long since become a stranger to him, but he could not forget her look, her laughter, her movements. Each of her meetings with James was like a knife in the heart. He felt how her shadow continued to haunt him, despite all his attempts to forget, despite those few weeks when he tried to return to normal life. But it is impossible to forget the person who was your life. He didn't know why all this had happened. He tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence, that she had never been his. But his heart, which was being torn deeper and deeper by her memories, protested. He couldn't forgive her for leaving. He couldn't accept the fact that her life had taken a different path, and that she was now a stranger to him. Every day, watching her with James, he felt a growing sense of helplessness. He couldn't control his feelings anymore. Charlie knew he was not a weak man. He was used to struggling against difficulties. But struggling against his own disappointment was something new, something that defied his efforts. A storm was growing inside him. He could not stand the way she, with her bright eyes, her cheerful smile, and her confidence, walked away from him as if he had never meant anything to her. It was unbearable. He was not ready to accept it. Parkville was still a peaceful town, but now everything that happened there seemed distant and alien. He continued to coach the team, but it was becoming more difficult with each passing day. He saw his players trying to keep up with his pace, following his orders, but their eyes were no longer the same. They saw him not just as a coach, but as a man who was losing himself. His frustration was becoming more obvious, his words were becoming harsher, but no amount of work or training could help Charlie forget. He returned home, and in his head those memories of Lucy that he tried to drown out sounded more and more often. He could not push her image out of his head, no matter how hard he tried. It was like a painful illness that was impossible to cope with. Even the nights were alien to him. The silence in the house made him think about what he had done wrong, what he had lost. He replayed in his head over and over the moments when their relationship still seemed simple, when everything was possible. But now, in this cold world where she had disappeared, he did not know how to start everything anew. Lucy, meanwhile, continued to live her life. She no longer paid attention to what was happening around her without thinking about the consequences. James became her world, her support, her future. Every day she became more and more confident in her decisions. More and more she felt that she was on the right path. She believed that her life now had meaning, but in her soul there was an empty place that she could not fill. Lucy tried not to think about Charlie, but when she still tried to remember their past, she felt uncomfortable. She tried to reassure herself that she had done everything right, that now she was on her own path. One evening, when fog had fallen over Parkville and the streets seemed empty, Charlie stood outside his house and looked out the window, as if waiting for something. His gaze was as empty as the night itself, and it seemed as if the world around him had ceased to exist for him. He felt his body tighten with tension, nerves racing through his veins. He knew he couldn't go on living the way he had been living. He felt his decision coming as something inevitable, as the last line in his path. He began to walk the streets of Parkville often, looking for something but not knowing what. Sometimes he would wander for hours along the empty roads, feeling his steps echoing throughout the empty countryside. He did not know what he wanted from these walks, but it seemed to him that he needed to find an answer in this gray landscape, among these familiar scenes that were now alien to him. He could not find peace in his mind, and perhaps that was why his steps became faster and his actions more desperate. One night like this, when even the streets of Parkville seemed uninviting, Charlie decided to find a solution. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't afford to be weak. He knew he was once the one who didn't give up, who was in control of his life, but now everything was different. There was only one person in his mind, Lucy, and the thought of her gone was unbearable. He returned home, and in the darkness of his small house, surrounded by emptiness, he began to plan. Thoughts that he had long tried to suppress flashed through his mind, but now they became more and more clear. He could not be a passive witness to what was happening to his life, and now he was ready to act. But what was he going to do? How to get back what he had lost? How to get her back, his Lucy? The next morning, Charlie woke up without an answer. He only knew one thing. He couldn't just sit and wait any longer. Time seemed to have stopped moving in Parkville. Each day, its routine became more and more suffocating. Charlie Blake knew he couldn't go on living the way he had before. The inner conflict he had long tried to suppress was now a storm, ready to destroy everything in its path. He could feel the pain, the rage, the unspoken resentment tearing at him from the inside. He was no longer the same person he had been a few months ago. His composure had crumbled, and all that was left was a fierce determination. Every night, lying in bed, he could find no peace. His mind was occupied only with Lucy, her image, her face, her departure, her new life with James. He could not cope with the fact that she had chosen him and not him. His pride and self-esteem were crumbling before his eyes, and something inside him was broken, like a fragile object that could not be repaired. Charlie knew that his feeling of pain had now transformed into something more, an uncontrollable rage. He could no longer control these feelings. Jealousy and resentment were his only companions, and they permeated his every day. He continued to work with the team, but his attention was completely absorbed by something else. He didn't notice how he was gradually losing control, even over training. His shouts became more and more aggressive, and his criticism became harsh. He felt that he was losing himself, that he could no longer be the calm and balanced coach he had been before. But it didn't matter anymore. All he could feel was the pain of his life no longer having meaning. When Charlie passed Lucy in the school hallways, he often began to wonder what would have happened if he hadn't made those mistakes. What if he hadn't been so harsh, hadn't been so oblivious to her feelings and needs? What if he had realized in time that she was tired of him trying to control her life? But now, it was too late. He couldn't go back to those days when everything was so simple, so clear. Everything was ruined, and that fact was eating away at him more and more. His gaze on Lucy became more and more restless. He watched her every move, every step. He began to notice how she and James walked together more and more often, how they showed their closeness without embarrassment. He could not allow himself to forget their last days, their last conversations. These memories haunted him like ghosts, giving him no peace. Charlie tried to hide from it all, but he couldn't. He began spending more and more time on the streets of Parkville, trying to find some solace in the foggy silence that now surrounded him. But even in that silence, his thoughts of Lucy grew louder and clearer. He knew that she would never come back, that her life had taken a different path, and that to her, he was just a part of the past she was trying to forget. When Charlie first realized that his feelings for Lucy had become almost pathologically attached, he tried to suppress them. But the more he tried to hide from his thoughts, the stronger they became. He could no longer live in this unbearable reality. He felt his rage grow into obsession, and this anxiety became his own shadow, haunting him at every turn. One evening, as Parkville was shrouded in fog, Charlie decided he had to act. He knew he couldn't sit and wait any longer. His patience had run out. He knew that if he wanted his life back, his power back, he had to intervene. There were no other options in his mind. He couldn't let Lucy be with James any longer. He couldn't let her go and leave him in this empty world where there was nothing but pain and hatred. He had to do something. That evening, as soon as it got dark, Charlie went out into the streets again. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but deep down he knew that today his life would change. He felt his hands clench into fists, his body filled with some kind of cold determination that left no room for doubt. He knew that all of this would lead to a final confrontation, but he wasn't afraid. He had long ago lost everything he could lose. Now there was only one choice left, to go all the way. As he passed the school stadium, Charlie paused. He felt his gaze drifting toward the dark stands, the fog beginning to thicken around him, and everything seemed different. It was a sign that things had gone too far. He couldn't just be an observer anymore. When he stopped, his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it pulsing in his neck. Charlie knew he was at a point in his life that would change everything. He had to do this. He had to face what had been in his soul for a long time, what demanded he fix everything he had broken. Lucy had become part of his internal struggle, part of the chaos he could no longer control. And with every step she took, with every new glance she exchanged with James, Charlie sank deeper into darkness. He couldn't just be an observer. His life was on the verge of becoming unbearably cruel. Time in Parkville continued to move along as usual, but for Charlie Blake each day was more and more foggy, unclear, like the clouds that often hung over the town. He could no longer find any peace. More and more despair, suppressed anger, and a sense of loss were growing in his soul, and the combination was becoming more and more dangerous with each passing day. He did not know what to do, how to regain control, but one thing was clear to him. He could no longer allow things to continue as they had been. His life was becoming a never-ending battle with his own demons. He tried to maintain his calm exterior during training with the team, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. He could see how his players sensed that something was wrong. His aggressive shouts, his criticism, everything was becoming unbearable for them. Charlie could no longer be who he had been before. He was crumbling from the inside, and it was obvious to everyone. But he couldn't stop, didn't know how to get rid of this feeling that continued to threaten him. At night, when the city streets were empty and the fog covered everything around, he went out for walks again. He walked for a long time until he began to feel how his inner tension was growing with each step, and his thoughts became darker. He remembered Lucy more and more often, her leaving, her look full of confidence when she decided to leave with him, with James. He thought about how easily she could leave everything that was between them, as if it did not matter. He tried to understand how she could do such a thing, but it was too painful. He could not understand how she could be so sure of her decision, as if their past together did not exist at all. With each passing day, his despair grew into an obsession. He began to feel that there was an invisible bond between him and Lucy that could not be broken. He felt her presence in every corner of Parkville, in every familiar place, in every moment he experienced. But this bond was no longer what it had been before. Now it was frightening, destructive. Lucy was no longer his, and he could not accept it. He could not let her go. Day after day, his thoughts became more and more absurd and dangerous. He painted pictures in his head of how everything could be returned, how he could return her. Charlie was not ready to accept that her decision had finally put an end to their relationship. He would seek her gaze, try to feel her presence in the crowd. He tried to restore the connection that once seemed so strong but was now destroyed. One night, when the whole city was asleep, Charlie went for a walk again. He walked through the park where they had once walked together, through the same streets where their conversation seemed endless. He stood on a bridge and looked down at the dark river, feeling his gaze getting lost in the darkness. This place had been special to him, but now it was empty. He could find no comfort here. His mind was overwhelmed by the growing need to change something, to fix something. He knew that if he didn't do it, he couldn't go on living. The idea was taking over him completely. His intentions were becoming more and more vague and uncertain. But one thing was clear. He could no longer sit back and watch Lucy build her life with James. Charlie felt his inner world crumbling, his feelings transforming into something more dangerous. As he walked home, his steps grew heavier. He could find no peace, no comfort. His mind was filled with Lucy, her leaving, her life, James. Everything was a dark, impenetrable mass. Charlie knew he could no longer simply endure it in silence. He could not be an observer. Several days passed, and this internal storm continued to build. Charlie increasingly realized that he was on the edge. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on. He felt his mind abandoning logic, common sense. He couldn't shake this need that was growing inside him like a malignant tumor. One day, after another long night out, he came to the realization that he couldn't afford to be weak any longer. He felt like his decisions had to be drastic. He couldn't be the person who stood by and watched his life fall apart. He had to take control, make sure his life finally got back on track. And in that moment, Charlie realized that all he needed was her back. He didn't know how to do it, but inside him there was growing confidence that he could find a way. The fog in his head began to clear, and he knew that from this moment on his life would never be the same. He was ready to go to extremes to get back what he had lost. Charlie was no longer just a coach who had forgotten his purpose. He was something more. He was a man who had stopped believing in forgiveness, in the possibility of restoration. He was ready to take action without stopping. Everything that stood before him now seemed achievable. The night was his ally, and in that silence among the foggy streets of Parkville, Charlie made a decision. As dawn broke through the fog, Charlie Blake felt the tension building inside him. There was no longer any doubt in his mind, no room for reflection. Everything he had experienced in the last weeks, every word, every look, every unbearable scene with Lucy and James had led him to this moment. He was on the edge, and his actions were now inevitable. He knew he could no longer afford to be a weak observer. Everything that had been had burned away. Everything that could have been had drowned in the pain and rage that was consuming his soul. And now there was no turning back. Charlie wasn't ready to just let things go. He couldn't admit his weakness. Every day since Lucy had left, he'd felt the world shrink around him. Even Parkville, his hometown, had become a stranger. Its streets, its houses, even its people all seemed part of the life he'd lost. And in that emptiness, that lack of meaning, his mind searched for an answer, for a solution that could bring him back to a world where things still mattered. He couldn't forget how calmly Lucy returned to her life, how confidently she walked forward without looking back. It seemed that she had stopped remembering him, had stopped feeling everything that had happened between them. And now that James had become her new support, Charlie couldn't come to terms with it. He was sure that her departure couldn't have been painless, that she had felt something too, but she hadn't chosen him. And that was impossible for him. During those long nights when fog covered the city and the streets were empty, Charlie thought over the plan that had been in his head ever since he realized that he could not take anything back. His thoughts gradually became colder and more determined. He knew that this situation would not end peacefully. He could no longer walk away from his decision, and the more he thought about it, the more determined he became. His mind was filled with one thing. He needed to stop this, to get back everything that had been lost. Charlie began to track Lucy's every move, every time she appeared in the city. He saw her with James, saw them walking in the same places they had once walked together. It only added fuel to the fire of his frustration, and a growing feeling that there was nothing left but the cruel need to get her back, even by methods he could barely comprehend. One evening, as the city was falling into darkness and the sky was turning a cold purple, Charlie stood in front of Lucy's house. He knew she would be there. There was no thought in his mind other than getting through this moment. He stood in front of her door, watching the fire inside her house smoldering through the windows, illuminating the gloom. He saw her and James sitting inside, talking, her laughter cutting through his ears again. He felt his body filling with anxiety, a feeling building inside him that he could no longer ignore. He stepped closer, feeling his heart beat faster. Charlie didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know what he was going to do, but his steps moved forward, as if someone was pushing him from behind. He knew it was now or never. Charlie raised his hand and his fingers touched the door. 3 seconds was not enough for him to realize that he had already crossed the line. His intentions, his actions could no longer be stopped. He could hear voices inside the house, but it all seemed distant, empty. The only thing that mattered was that he was here, that everything had happened as he had long ago decided. A moment later, the door opened. Lucy stood before him, her eyes uncertain, but also something else, pity, perhaps, or fear. He couldn't say which, but it was enough to solidify his resolve. She was in front of him, and that moment was decisive. Charlie didn't know how he'd gotten here, but he felt like he couldn't go back. His gaze was full of rage and pain. He could no longer control what was happening to him. He knew that his actions would lead to something that would be unforgivable, but he could not stop. His body tensed and he took a step forward. Parkville, that once calm and familiar town, now seemed like a different place. It was part of this nightmare that Charlie had created. Lucy, her life, James, all of it was the reason he was here. But now, in this moment, he couldn't turn back. The life that had once seemed whole and complete had been destroyed by his own hands. He moved closer to her, feeling the space between them disappear. And the moment his hands found her shoulders, the moment he felt her warmth and fear, all that was left was the moment when it could all end. Charlie knew he couldn't stop. The world around them went silent, and all that was left was darkness.